Okay, welcome to this presentation from the Open the Great Highway Alliance. We have a number of things to provide you with updates on. Next slide. I am Peter Paroli, and I am a founding member of the Open the Great Highway Alliance. We are a bunch of people who found each other last year over this particular issue and formed a grassroots nonprofit organization. And our goal is mainly to inform and educate the public of the dangers of not reopening the Upper Great Highway. And we have a lot of concerns, primarily centering around the impact of the closure on the environment, the detrimental effects on climate change, the negative impact on traffic safety, the inequitable burdens that it places on commuters and people who work, and the effects that it has on people with disabilities or health needs who really need to get around by car. And so we've been engaged in a number of activities centered around combating misinformation and combating the anti-democratic forces in city government. And we've achieved a number of things. So we've got 16,000 signatures to reopen the Great Highway. We've done community organization to get our voices heard at public meetings. We've been able to meet with the mayor's office and individual members of the Board of Supervisors. And I think because of these efforts, we were able to get a partial reopening of the Great Highway in August 2021. Now, we've gone further and we now have a lawsuit to reverse street closures, including the Great Highway, but also including John F. Kennedy Drive in Golden Gate Park, as well as Martin Luther King Drive in Golden Gate Park. And we are waiting to hear back from the judge on an injunction. Next slide. So just to give you a bit of context, most people will know that the Upper Great Highway is a major commuter and recreation artery. Before COVID, the estimate was that there was about 17,600 to 19,900 vehicles per day traveling north and south on the Upper Great Highway. And now it looks like we're back to those numbers, somewhere in the 18,000 to 20,000 range every single day. It has no cross traffic. We do have mixed use pedestrian bike paths and sufficient capacity for people to bike and walk as well as drive. And yet it is arguably the safest roadway in San Francisco. And I'll talk later about the fact that we have only been able to find one accident in the 2017 to 2021 timeframe, which is certainly better than any other street that we know of in San Francisco. Next slide. So just to give you the thumbnail sketch about the history of the closure, back in April 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic, Supervisor Gordon Marr asked that the Great Highway remain closed for the duration of a shelter-in-place order that had been put into effect. And we had the shelter-in-place order because public officials recommended that we get outside to exercise to improve mental and physical health while we were sheltering in place. If you remember what it was like back then, of course, bars and restaurants and pretty much everything was closed, and many parks and beaches were closed, so there weren't really that many places to go outdoors. And so it made a great deal of sense to have places like the Great Highway open so that people could exercise and walk in a socially distanced way. But shelter in place was lifted, but the roads have remained closed. So partly through our pressure and partly because the reality of the change in this emergency, Recreation and Parks Director Phil Ginsburg reopened the Great Highway in August 2021, but he keeps it closed on weekends. And even worse, he closes it at Fridays at noon because of this so-called emergency in public interest. Next slide. So why are the roads still closed? So early on, the pro-closure folks were saying, well, it's because of COVID and the COVID emergency. But the reality is it was closed because of shelter in place and because public health officials recommended outdoor exercise during shelter in place, but that's over. And as we can see in these photos, we now have people going to concerts at Golden Gate Park, outdoor lands. People are going to bars again, and the gyms are open again. So there's really not the same kind of need that we had back in the early days of the pandemic. Next slide. So the pro-closures will now say, well, it reduces cars on the road. But we have been able to find through public records requests for engineering reports and particularly one called the West Side Circulation Study, that actually those vehicles, those 18,000 to 20,000 vehicles per day, are just diverting onto the surface streets in the neighborhoods and onto Sunset Boulevard, which is the other major artery in the West Side. And so the cars do not magically disappear when we close the highway. Next slide. So this has an impact on climate change, which is the other reason that pro-closure folks say that the Great Highway is closed. Diverted traffic travels more miles, and more miles means more greenhouse gases. And this chart on the right here just shows that for every extra mile traveled by 18,000 plus vehicles per day, you get more metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions, plus a lot of other bad stuff. So closing the Great Highway is not good for climate. Next slide. Pro-closure folks will also say that, well, closing a road makes things safer. There's less cars, less accidents. But as I said before, the Great Highway had only one accident over 2017, 2021. And now that cars are diverted onto some of the least safe streets in our neighborhoods, in particular Sunset Boulevard, people are witnessing more accidents. And these are just photos from folks who have sent in pictures of accidents to the Upper Great Highway Alliance, and everybody knows that things are worse. Next slide. So finally, pro-closure folks will say, well, we like it. And they'll simply say, well, closed streets are used by a lot of pedestrians, bikers, and skateboards, and so they should just remain closed. Well, while the city is reporting all sorts of astronomical usage rates for these closed streets, we were also able to get through public records requests data that actually shows that the Upper Great Highway declined in usage over the 2020-21 timeframe. So on the right here is a chart where every blue dot represents the weekly total of users of the Great Highway while it was closed over all the weeks in 2021. And what you see is week after week, month after month, there's a steady decline in the usage of the Great Highway up until the point where Phil Ginsburg of Rec and Parks decided to reopen it. So the bottom line is there's no real good reason why the roads are still closed. So now I'd like to hand it over to the meat of the discussion here. We have an agenda with a number of presentations by members of the Open the Great Highway Alliance. And I'd like to hand it over to Michael, who will be talking about collusion. Michael.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Next slide, please. I just wanted to take a few minutes to describe some of what we've been up against. So from the beginning, many of us who believe that the Great Highway should be open to vehicles and shared by everyone felt that we've been fighting an uphill battle. The efforts and misinformation coming from the city agencies and the activist groups almost felt coordinated. And as we've discovered, they are. There's an ongoing financial relationship between at least two of these activist groups and the city. The Bike Coalition and Walk SF have entered into several contracts with SFMTA since 2019. I'll touch briefly on the two sole source contracts, which currently total $1.6 million. The terms of these contracts are virtually identical. The Bike Coalition and Walk SF are responsible for promoting and conducting activities to encourage walking, biking, and transit among students and families. This is part of the Safe Routes to School program. Now, these contracts were originated before the start of the pandemic. However, for more than a full school year since then, public school instruction was conducted remotely. For many people, the safest route to school during this period was walking from their bedroom to the kitchen table. Said another way, the city was paying these groups a lot of money to promote safe routes to school while students were attending school from home. Despite this, both contracts were amended in late 2021, and the amounts were actually increased 50% from their original totals. These contracts represent a significant funding source for these groups. Just for reference, the Bike Coalition has annual revenues of about $900,000, and Walk SF has annual revenues of about $800,000. So not only is there a financial relationship, but there's a significant degree of financial dependence on the city by these groups to operate and pay their employees. Next slide, please. So the financial relationships are one thing. However, we also found that these activist groups routinely coordinate with the agencies on these matters. We obtained several emails discussing the Great Highway proposals and discovered how pervasive this practice is. Regarding the Great Highway, employees from SFMTA, Rec and Park, and SFCTA frequently discussed the proposals with representatives from the Bike Coalition, Walk SF, and even the Great Highway Park Initiative. The degree of preferential access to city employees by activists is not enjoyed by those with opposing views or even the general public. These groups coordinate their efforts so everyone can all be on the same page. That's a direct quote. And the communications go both ways. Sometimes the activists reach out to city employees, and sometimes it's the other way around. Unsolicited emails from activists are sometimes answered by city employees within minutes. City employees will connect activists to other city employees, sometimes in different agencies, just to make sure that they're in touch with the right people. City employees will also give advance notice of upcoming public meetings and policy proposals to ensure that the activist groups and their members will attend and weigh in on those matters. There were several meetings among these groups to coordinate their efforts before the important June 10th joint hearing about the future of the Great Highway. Despite these ongoing discussions, the Bike Coalition was still able to arrange another last-minute check-in with SFMTA and Rec and Park staff the day before this important hearing. About a year ago, the SFCTA conducted a flawed survey regarding the Great Highway as part of its District 4 mobility study. Although flawed, the results of this survey are still being promoted by advocates today to claim that most people want the road closed to vehicles. The survey was not broadly advertised and was only open for 5 weeks during the holiday season. Just over half the responses came from the westernmost neighborhoods most impacted by the Great Highway. On the other hand, there were a fair number of responses from the Mission and Bernal Heights neighborhoods. And about 200 responses came from outside of the city. Most people that I know of in the outer Richmond were not even aware of the survey, including myself, but a couple hundred people from Oakland and Daly City somehow knew about it. It turns out the Bike Coalition was in touch with SFCTA from the very beginning of the D4 mobility study. And they made sure their members knew about the survey and certainly took the Great Highway Survey. Next slide, please. So this slide essentially just summarizes what I've just covered, so I'll be brief. These relationships put anyone with opposing views at a distinct disadvantage. And again, all of these coordinated efforts are taking place with activist groups that are being paid by these same city agencies. I will say just one more thing. We have seen and heard about similar practices with other road proposals, such as car-free JFK Drive and slow streets. So the issues we've identified here are definitely not unique to the Great Highway. And that's all I have, so I will turn it over to you, Judy. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your interest and attendance to this presentation by those of us who have put together the information we are sharing with you tonight. The negative impacts of a closed Great Highway are very real to me as I live across the street from it. Phil Ginsburg wants to line the Great Highway with food trucks, vendors, billboards, signs, and nationally advertise it as a tourist attraction. Heartfelt gratitude to each of you who joined us in submitting one of the 99 appeals sent to Rec and Park opposing food trucks on the Great Highway. We succeeded in stopping his pilot program from continuing beyond February 13th. We've received calls of thanks from our local coffee shop and restaurant owners. The last thing these small businesses need is a Great Highway filled with vendors keeping sales from their front doors after they've suffered through mandated closures, vandalism, removal of street parking for customers, and other hardships brought on by the pandemic and MTA's ongoing construction and street closures. To update, on February 3, 2022, Gordon Marr and RPD held a meeting with local merchants to get feedback from them regarding their feelings about food trucks and signs to advertise their businesses on the Great Highway. They were unanimously opposed to both. After hearing this, instead of agreeing to permanently discontinue the pilot, RPD announced that they are temporarily putting it on hold until they do more outreach to different merchants in the community. This is what is done when they do not get a response that supports their agenda. Next slide, please. The heavy influx of tourists and others to the Great Highway is destroying the sand dunes, which are classified as a national wildlife sanctuary. When foot traffic replaces motor vehicle traffic on the highway, pedestrians with their children and pets have no boundaries and escalate the erosion of this sacred area. Instead of using the crosswalks to get from their cars to the beach, They trample over the city's landscaping, continuing onto the fragile dunes where they picnic, discard litter, allow their kids to slide down the dunes on cardboard sleds, flattening and killing the seagrasses. Umbrellas, chairs, tents, and bicycles are on the dunes all weekend as never before. If you live here, it's heartbreaking to watch. Next slide, please. Rec and Park installed devices they called echo counters on the Great Highway to collect data of usage of the highway by all people except people driving or riding in motor vehicles. By obtaining documents and speaking to representatives of both Rec and Park and the company who sold them the equipment, I've been able to understand how they function and their limitations. No one denies, not RPD or this company, that the data collected from these counters reflect inflated numbers of users of the highway due to individuals being overcounted multiple times, either unintentionally or deliberately. I can provide more in details, but here are a few of the many ways this happened. Heavily advertised citywide one-time special events that drew hundreds to the area for a few hours were counted as normal monthly usage. Think marches for Black Lives Matter, Asians Against Hate, a Halloween event, rally, bicycle and foot races, where if you closed any street anywhere in San Francisco for these purposes, you'd get unusually high numbers. By strategically placing the sensors to face each other at opposite ends of the crosswalk, any person walking or bicycling over the crosswalk is counted once by the sensor they're close to and once by the one on the opposite side, because some sensors on the Great Highway have a range to record something passing them from as far away as 50 feet. One person pacing in front of a counter 20 times will be recorded as 20 different people. The echo counters are heat sensors with no cameras or videos or way to distinguish if the heat is from a person, animal, or vehicle, or if it has recorded the same person over and over. The average pedestrian was counted 4 times because most people make a loop to go out the way they came in and passed by the same 2 opposing sensors coming and going and were counted twice by each sensor. A bicyclist doing 6 loops in a day was counted as 24 people that day. RPD claims the devices don't count cars, but in fact, these sensors do pick up the heat from a vehicle passing by them, such as an early morning street cleaning machine, a park ranger's vehicle, a police car, or a truck from DPW or RPD that passes by the counter will generate so much heat that it might count as 1,000 people walking by. Despite the fact that RPD has said the data collected from these echo counters is their main source of data, in response to 3 public information record requests I sent them, I received a response yesterday from RPD's records custodian that RPD has no records of data from those counters from 2020 through 2021. Next slide, please. We are asking that an independent agency be employed by the city to collect, analyze, and present data instead of RPD. They cannot be trusted to do this impartially since they have an agenda to permanently close the Great Highway and the rest of our streets. Phil Ginsburg's lack of transparency and accountability to the public is why he is facing the Ethics Commission for allegations of willful misconduct by the Sunshine Task Force. We, the public, are entitled to honesty and representation. Please help us hold them accountable. Let's share and maintain the Great Highway and protect our pristine beach. Now, Patricia will speak about the lack of access to the disabled. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. I'm going to talk about how these road closures have affected the disabled. First, let's just talk a little bit about the background of the ADA laws. They were part of the civil rights movement, which began in 1964, and Congress codified these ADA laws in 1990. The underlying principle of civil rights laws is equal access. And with the ADA laws, the disabled became a part of the protected class who deserved equal access. However, we, the disabled, are being denied equal access in San Francisco because of the policies of Park and Rec on Great Highway and JFK Drive. First, I'd like to talk about JFK Drive. Many disabled taxpayers are denied equal access to the amenities on the eastern portion of JFK Drive, and I'm one of those people. Wheelchairs, walkers, and rollators, and which I use, a rollator, we have absolutely no way to access this part of the park. We cannot walk, bike, take transit, or a shuttle. The only means that I can ever get to that area of the park is in a private car with someone along with me to help. Park and Rec seems to have no clue, or more likely, doesn't care about aiding the disabled. The website has no information about the shuttle. Is it accessible? What kind of accessible elements does it have? There's nothing. We insist that the RPD refuses the complete closure of JFK Drive and return it to its pre-pandemic status. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to move to the Great Highway, and I have several different things to talk about here. On the Great Highway, RPD ignores the needs of the disabled or cynically pretends to conform to ADA laws so they can check the box that they are meeting the equal access mandate. First, let's talk about the negligent maintenance of the highway, the paths, and the ramps, making them dangerous. In photo number 1, that's the Great Highway. Hard to tell because you can't see the road, but that's the way it looked last spring. And in photo 2, here's the bike path that's on the east side of the highway. It's supposed to be 16 feet wide. Here you can see the overgrowth of the ice plant, the dirt and the sand that is obstructing the asphalt pavement and making it unsafe for disabled people. Next slide, please. Photo number 3, this is the ramp to the seawall. Again, it's overgrown with ice plant and it has sand and dirt on the ramp itself, making it unsafe for anybody who's using a wheelchair or a rollator. And then photo number 4, you have the promenade on the seawall, which is below the Great Highway, and it's completely and totally covered in sand. This was from last spring. Not only is this unsafe for someone with a rollator or a wheelchair, but it's also unsafe for ordinary able-bodied people walking. Now, the most egregious decision by RPD recently has been them erecting a sign, 2 signs actually. In photo 5, you see it says handicapped accessible entrance at Rivera Street. Now, if you take a look at photo 7, that's the handicapped accessible access. Notice the gravel and the patching and the incline. The incline is not ADA compliant. The pavement is extremely rough, and that is not an ADA safe ramp from the lower Great Highway up to the bike path and the highway. Take a look at photo 6. That is the exit from the ramp at Pacheco. And notice again, the cracks in the pavement, the rough texture, the gravel, and the very steep incline where the ramp meets the road. Now, I went out to Pacheco, the Pacheco ramp going up to the Great Highway the other day with my physical therapist. I had my rollator and he kept a very tight control over me, and I went up this path. The asphalt is mixed with very coarse gravel. It's extremely rough with bumps and ridges, and I felt very unsafe throughout the entire trip up and down. And where the road, where the ramp meets the lower Great Highway, there is a drop of about a 70 degree drop down to the roadway. This is not in any possible way ADA compliant. It's too steep and it's too rough and pockmarked, bumps. It's completely not safe for anybody in a wheelchair or who uses a walker or a rollator. So these are some of my ideas and opinions that are shared by many people. And I think it's fair to say that RPD openly excludes disabled people and lies about safe access from the Great Highway in spite of state and federal AD laws. This sign in photo number 5, those signs should not be there. They should be either covered over or removed because RPD is putting fragile, disabled people in danger by suggesting that they use these ramps at Rivera and Pacheco. We pay taxes like everybody else and deserve to have equal access, but our ableist city agencies are more interested in catering to able-bodied people and the bike coalition exclusively. This is wrong and illegal, but no one seems to care in city government. The lack of equity and equal access for disabled people is shameful. Thank you for listening, and I'm going to turn you over now to Charlie, who's going to talk to you about the sunshine laws.
Thanks, Patricia. Hi, my name is Charlie Perkins. I'm a 32-year resident of San Francisco. I live in the Sunset District, and I wanted to update everyone on a fairly recent development that I have been intimately involved with. So we've seen from some of the other presenters, and many of you listening have probably learned this for yourself, that Park and Rec and SFMTA have been advancing this agenda of theirs to close streets to cars using provably false information and false data and using one-sided propaganda means. And that's been going on throughout since the pandemic began, basically. They saw this as an opportunity to try to push through agenda items that otherwise might not be feasible. We've also seen that much of what they've been doing has been behind closed doors, out of the public eye. It's absolutely clear that these people, Mr. Ginsburg and the others at Rec and Park, Mr. Tumlin and the others at SFMTA, they don't want the public to see what they're doing. They don't want the politicians to see what they're doing. They don't want the curtain pulled back and have exposed the special interest groups that they're collaborating with, the false data that they're proffering. So back in I don't know, late 60s, throughout the 70s, there was a trend throughout the country to sort of put an end to sort of the, back room, dark cigar smoke-filled rooms of where all government business took place, and to open things up to public scrutiny. Transparency became the key. Politicians, government officials, they're being paid our tax dollars, and the people should have a right to know what is happening. And so a series of laws were passed, the Freedom of Information Act at the federal level. In California, you have the California Public Records Act and various open meetings laws. And in San Francisco, we have something called the Sunshine Ordinance, But all of these laws are designed to give the public access and the right to see what is happening behind the scenes and to sort of shine light on government actions. Frustrated by what was happening with the Great Highway closure, in April of 2021, I submitted a pretty significant public records request to Rec and Park, which essentially sought basically every document out there that was related to the closure of the Great Highway. All documents related to the decision to close it in the first place, all documents related to the ongoing efforts to keep it closed, all documents related to the data collection practices that they were supposedly engaged in, and a whole lot of other things. And you know, it wasn't a complete surprise, but basically they blew me off. I didn't hear anything. They just ignored my public records demand. And there were various interim actions, but I'll cut to the chase. I eventually filed a complaint with San Francisco's Sunshine Ordinance Task Force, which is an 11-member body appointed by the Board of Supervisors that is charged with essentially administering the open government laws in San Francisco and sort of policing those laws. And so I filed my complaint, and in early January, I had a hearing before the Sunshine Ordinance Task Force. And lo and behold, the task force, there was 9 members sitting that day. They unanimously found that that I was right, that Mr. Ginsburg and Recreation and Park had violated the law by refusing to produce documents in response to my request. If I could have the next slide, please. But there was something pretty unusual about the finding in my case. They didn't simply conclude that that Mr. Ginsburg and Rec and Park had violated the law, but they went a step further, and they found that it wasn't just, you know, something slipped through the cracks, they accidentally did this. They were essentially acting in good faith and couldn't comply, though. No, instead they made a finding, a unanimous finding, that Phil Ginsburg personally had committed a willful violation of the Sunshine Ordinance. And this is a section from the San Francisco Administrative Codes, which talks about what a willful failure to comply with the Sunshine Ordinance is, or the Open Meetings Acts. And you'll see here that it says that a willful violation of your legal duties is considered to be official misconduct under local law. Next slide, please. And if we look here to the city's charter, this is the San Francisco charter. It talks about what official misconduct means, and that's any behavior by a public officer that basically is in bad faith, that falls below the standard of decency, good faith, and right action impliedly required of public officers. And a willful violation of the law, which is official misconduct, can lead to various things: discipline and even removal from office. So we now have a unanimous finding by the Sunshine Ordinance Task Force, the body charged with administering the open government laws in San Francisco, that Phil Ginsburg personally engaged in activities that constitute official misconduct. You know, and this is really unusual, and this is highly significant. What will become of this? It's hard to say. The Sunshine Ordinance Task Force has referred my matter to the San Francisco Ethics Commission for further handling and consideration. But in doing so, they made clear as day that they were not referring it to the Ethics Commission for the Ethics Commission to decide whether there was willfulness. But no, the Sunshine Ordinance Task Force made clear that they themselves had found willful misconduct, a willful violation. the Open the Great Highway Alliance, we've written to Mayor Breed and we've pointed this out and we've insisted that she remove Mr. Ginsburg from his position. Our taxpayer dollars are paying somebody who is engaged in official misconduct, and that's just not right. He's violated the public trust, and he has no right. He should not have any right to continue to supposedly serve the citizens of San Francisco. So far, there's been crickets from the mayor's office, so I don't know what's going to come of that, but that is where we are. And with that, I'm going to wrap up my presentation. I thank you all for coming. We all thank you all for listening here. And if anybody has questions or would like to get involved in this effort, or if there's anything else that we can help you with, please contact us or go to our website, www.openthegreathighway.com. There's all sorts of good information there if you just want to learn more. There's contact information for us. And with that, we'll bring this to a close. And thank you very much.